Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really pumped. Is anyone else super pumped? Right? I love the energy. I'm really excited. First of all, thank you all so much for coming out today. This is a really special and important event, and I'm really glad that we're all here to really take time to read and talk about this book. You know, something that I love so much about this is just the practice of documenting letters. Letters are a really special practice that a lot of us don't really do much often. So it's really special to have these letters and to get a sneak peek into the lives of Langston Hughes and so many other revolutionaries that we get to read and hear about. So thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you, MaryLouise, and your co-editor, Evelyn Louise Crawford, for putting this together. Thank you, Ruthie, who is the director for the Center of Place, Culture, and Politics, for being here with us. Thank you all so much. This is really important work, and we're really happy to have you here. I also realized I got straight into it and didn't introduce myself. Hi, if you can't tell, I'm really excited. My name is Saidi. I'm the education coordinator here at the People's Forum. If you haven't been here before, welcome. The People's Forum is a place for political education and cultural work, and we're really just here to build a better and stronger future, to learn from our past, and to help us guide towards the future. If this is your first time here, welcome. We'll see you again soon. And if you've been here before, thanks for coming back. We're really excited for this, and I am really happy that you've all joined us today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to MaryLouise.
Hi, everyone. I also want to say welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. Really happy to see you, those that I know and those that I'll meet tonight after our discussion. Thank you for coming. I just want to preface, we're getting ready to see a video that my co-author and I did that would introduce you to the period and the people that corresponded in this book. Some of you, all of you probably know the name, Langston Hughes. Some of you may know the names Louise and William Patterson, but it's doubtful that you know the names of Evelyn and Matt Crawford. And so this very brief film introduces you to them. I just want to say that the film was made by Nebi and myself, and I'm going to introduce Nebi in a moment. And we made it without permission. For those of you who are filmmakers or know anything about it, anytime you use anyone, you have to ask permission to use their material, use their faces, use their names, use whatever they've done. And we did not do that. So I just want to say that up front. We didn't do that, and please don't turn us in. Also, because we didn't do that, there are no labels. So you're going to see photographs of people. There are no labels. You're going to hear Paul Robeson's voice at the very beginning. But there are no labels that identify who people are. So if at the end you'd like to ask questions about who some of the people are that you're going to see, please don't hesitate to do that. And then lastly, I want to say that I want to introduce my co-author, who cannot be with us tonight because on November 19th in 2021, she left for other parts. And she was my oldest, my closest, my dearest sister friend. And so losing her has really left a huge hole. She was someone that anytime anything politically or sociopolitically was happening, she was the first person I'd call up. I'd be the first person she'd call up, and she'd say, "Okay, what's the line?" So we had that kind of relationship from before we were born. She was born in San Francisco. She grew up in Berkeley. She went to, and Ghana was the first country to be granted its independence by the great colonial godfather, Great Britain. And Nkrumah was the first African president. So people poured in from all over to Ghana, and she was there. W.B. Du Bois and Alpheus Hunton had been invited by Nkrumah to go in 1960 to go to Ghana to help start the Encyclopedia Africana. Du Bois died there. And so there was this, Ghana was a place that revolutionaries and progressives from all over Africa and from the Caribbean were kind of the Nkrumah as the magnet drew people there. And so there she is in this, kind of revolutionary progressive nest. She meets her husband to be there. And then there's the coup, and people fled, and she and her husband fled to France, where she had her son, and where she, being a polyglot, she was fluent in French, and she knew Spanish and Portuguese. She actually, while in Ghana, she had translated a book about the Brazilian slave trade from Portuguese into English. And then she's in Paris, and she finally comes back here to the States with her son, and wound up in Atlanta. She, prior to Atlanta, was a arts consultant. She was on the California Arts Council as an art consultant, and then was an independent art consultant, and moves to Atlanta, where she last lived. So I just wanted to say she's, for those who are materialists in the audience / maybe Marxists, I think of both her and my parents and her parents and Langston and just so many people from who I've lost, that matter is never destroyed. It's just transformed. And so they are here with us tonight, and she's here with us tonight, and I just wanted to present her. So without further ado, please, Saidi, please, let's see this film that she and I had cobbled together.
My curly-headed baby, I'll sing you fast to sleep and love you so
Am I in the way?
as I sing. Oh, my baby, my curly-headed baby, just tuck your head like little bird beneath its mother's.
We knew Langston Hughes from the very beginnings of our lives. On the occasion of our births, he wrote to each of us to welcome us into the world. He did this because of his close ties to our two sets of parents, Louise Thompson and William Patterson, and Evelyn Nebby Graves and Matt Crawford. When he learned of my arrival, he wrote me a card from Paris. It said, "To Nebby Lou from Langston. P.S. Glad you're here." And on a visit to California the following year, he saw me take my first steps.
When I came along a few years later, he sent me this handwritten first draft of this poem. "Mama, I found this soldier's cap lying in the snow. It has a red star on it. Whose is it? Do you know?" He also enclosed a letter. "Dear MaryLouise, this is for your first collection of original manuscripts. By the time you are old enough to read, I hope this war will be over. And by the time you are a big girl, I hope the red star will be shining everywhere, and that you will be here a long time to enjoy all of its blessings. So be a nice baby and take your cod liver oil and grow up strong. With love, from Langston." The story of the friendships between Langston Hughes, the Crawfords, and the Pattersons began with my mother, Louise Thompson, who would later become Louise Thompson Patterson. Louise was the first among our four parents to have a close personal friendship with Hughes, and it was she who brought her childhood friends, Matt Crawford and Evelyn Graves Crawford, into the poet's life.
Louise Thompson and my mother, Evelyn Graves, met in their teens and became best friends in the early 1920s, when Louise was a student at the University of California and my mother, Nebby, as she was known to family and friends, worked as a stenographer in San Francisco. My father, Matt Nathaniel Crawford, had migrated with his family to California from Anniston, Alabama, when he was a boy of 8 and attended high school with Louise in Oakland.
In the fall of 1927, Louise was a young teacher at Hampton Institute in Virginia. She and Langston met on the Hampton campus while he was there for a speaking engagement. Louise left Hampton soon after Hughes's appearance there and moved to Harlem. She had witnessed the brave student strike against the patronizingly racist white administration and felt she could no longer be part of the school. Once in Harlem, she became a part of the circle of artists and intellectuals whose most prominent figure was Langston Hughes. Earlier that year, my mother went to New York on vacation. During that brief trip, she met my father, San Francisco-born William Lorenzo Patterson, known as Pat to his friends. Pat and Langston had met earlier through their mutual friend, Paul Robeson, during the heyday of the Harlem Renaissance. Pat had settled in New York in 1920 and was well known in the community as one of Harlem's most prominent attorneys and dedicated political activists. He would later become a national leader of the American Communist Party.
Geen malers to geest dem letzten Wege, den Himmelen bleien verstellen bläue Tege, weil kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Schau, uns wird abbeugt und unser Trott mir seinen Blau.
In the summer of 1928, Nebby Graves vacationed in Harlem with her friend Louise, who introduced her to Langston Hughes and his circle of friends, including artist Aaron Douglas and his wife Alta, and the brilliant writer Wallace Thurman. Langston and Nebby hit it off immediately. After a few weeks of the fast Harlem life, she would return home to the Bay Area and her sweetheart, Matt Crawford, whom she married the following year. Louise, in her early days in New York, worked for a time as secretary to Langston and novelist and folklorist Zora Neale Hurston. She was hired by their wealthy white patron, Mrs. Charlotte Osgood Mason. The relationships with Mrs. Mason came to a dramatic halt when the Park Avenue matron saw that she could no longer control Langston or Louise. She abruptly dismissed and humiliated them both.
One night, Langston comes to my house. He had been down to Mrs. Mason's. She was a very, very wealthy woman who had been a patron of the arts all of her life. Her particular interest was in what she called primitive people. She did not want him to write poems or articles of social protest. She wanted him to remain primitive, as he said. She had to control you. When she couldn't control you, she threw you out of her life. He was heartbroken, and he had been very grateful to have somebody that, for a time, that he didn't have to worry about. His brother went to school in New England. He was at Lincoln going to college. He was able to get his book out. He had me to work for him. So here was a woman who just had to rule or tried to ruin. And she made it very hard for Langston for a long time.
In March of 1932, Langston was on a speaking tour when he wrote Matt Crawford for the first time from Langston, Oklahoma. Dear Mr. Crawford, thank you for your letter. I'd be happy to appear under the auspices you mentioned in Oakland or Berkeley. I shall be in California in April. I hope we shall meet. Tell Nebby I'm anxious to see her. Sincerely, Langston Hughes. By May of that year, my father and Langston had become fast friends. Late that month, Langston sent Matt a telegram about an exciting prospect, a trip to Moscow that Louise had been organizing from New York. Dear Matt, here's a copy of a wire from Louise. Moscow wires, all players must arrive Moscow by July 1st. Very necessary you arrive New York, ready to sail by June 15th. Have good group. Consult Matt. Wire immediately, Louise. So, if you're going, you'd have to get a passport at once. Airmail Louise your decision. I hope you can go, Langston. The group of young Black professionals, intellectuals, and artists had been invited to Moscow to make a film entitled Black and White about the state of race relations in the United States. Matt and Langston were roommates during their stay in the Soviet Union. There, in the heady atmosphere of the new socialism, they forged their friendship and commitment to radical political struggle. William Patterson had gone to the Soviet Union earlier. By 1928, he was seriously studying radical political philosophies and traveled to Moscow to continue to study socialism.
I was in Russia, and I went to make a motion picture for Measure-Film Film. The picture must have been about the race relations in the United States and the labor struggles here.
We got there, we found they had no idea what Black folk were like in this country. Langston tried to work on the script.
I said, well, I don't believe we could make a picture from this scenario that anybody would believe anywhere in the world. And eventually, the film was canceled.
We left Langston because he decided to go into depth writing about that period.
With a press card, I was able to travel all over the Soviet Union. And I particularly wanted to see the Asiatic portions because there are colored people like myself. So I wanted to go and see how they lived.
Matt, Louise, and Langston were profoundly affected and uplifted by their trip into Soviet Central Asia. On their return to the States, they would both become active in the fight to free the 9 Scottsboro boys of Alabama. At this time, they also joined the Communist Party, convinced that the only hope for Black Americans was a fundamental change in an oppressive political, economic, and social order. Langston remained in the Soviet Union until the spring of 1933.
In the States, Langston throws himself into the Scottsboro Boys case. A mass movement was building to free the young men. Langston wrote and spoke on their behalf and went to visit them at the Scottsboro, Alabama prison. Later in the 1930s, he would travel as a journalist for the Baltimore Afro-American to cover the Spanish Civil War. Louise had also gone to Spain to help with relief work.
Spain at that time was a focal point for anyone who had any social consciousness at all, especially writers came from all over the world to be in Spain. And so there was Langston.
A writer certainly has special duties, I would say, to society because the written word is a force, and to misuse that power, to use it for false or ugly or lying purposes would seem to me morally wrong.
When Langston came back from Spain in 1938, he said, "Lou, I want a theater."
Together in 1938, Langston and my mother founded the Harlem Suitcase Theater. Their most successful production that year was Langston's play, Don't You Want to Be Free?
Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Langston spent a great deal of time in Carmel, California, at the home of his wealthy friend Noel Sullivan. He would often come up to Berkeley to go to the barbershop and visit with my family. He was playful and lighthearted some of the time, but he also confided in my parents and sought a sense of family among us. He also would seek their advice on serious personal and political matters. He called this needing clarification. In 1941, he was attacked by the evangelist Amy Semple McPherson for an early poem he had written called Goodbye Christ. Occasionally, he was broke and borrowed small amounts of money from Matt and Nebby, paying them back promptly when he received his next check from a speaking engagement or a publishing project. In the early 1950s, Langston was called to testify about his political views before the infamous Senator McCarthy. Shortly after this ordeal in Washington, D.C., he sent our parents a summary of his testimony with a touching note explaining that, with the exception of Paul Robeson, He had not been forced to name names.
In June of 1957, Langston invited my parents and me to see his play, Simply Heavenly, on Broadway. My father, Pat, was very disturbed by the play and wrote Langston in part, "Dear Langston, Louise, Mary Lou, and I saw Simply Heavenly Tuesday night. Thanks for the tickets, and may I here and now very belatedly thank you for sending us I Wonder as I Wander and several other books. It is difficult to define my reaction to Simply Heavenly. I cannot say that I liked it. It did not appeal to me. Simply Heavenly does not say what so greatly needs to be said at this moment, Lang, at least not to me. So simple is the eternally recurring primitive Negro, so childishly simple and so simply childish. The time and place calls for something else. The Negro can today play the dominant moral role in American life. Thanks again. One must do more than dip one's fingers into progressive life. Sincerely, Pat." Langston answered the next day. In spite of Pat's harsh criticism, he replied without anger or surprise. "Dear Pat, I'm certainly sorry I wasn't at the theater the night you all came, as I would have loved to say hello to you. Your long letter is greatly appreciated, and your views valid in a number of ways, I am sure. When it comes to plays, it is a miracle to end up with anything at all one wishes left in the play, after 20 to 30 other people have had a hand in the creation, from the producers and director to actors. So all I can say is, I did the best I could under the circumstances. That it gets your serious consideration and you write me so helpful a letter is at least something to be grateful for. Best ever, and hope to see you and the family soon as work pressures let up. Sincerely, Langston." This correspondence could have caused a break in the friendship between these two men, but instead, their bonds of solidarity endured frank criticism and avidly held opinions.
In the 1950s and 60s, Langston's visits with us were less frequent, but he kept up with what we were doing and thinking. MaryLouise was studying in Moscow, and I was in graduate school in New York when news of her marriage to a fellow student at Patrice Lumumba Friendship University was announced. I called Langston to tell him about the news, and he was soon happy to receive her wedding picture. In the summer of 1966, on his way back to the States from Senegal, Langston passed through Paris, where I was living. My parents were visiting me at the time, and the four of us went out to dinner at a little restaurant in the Latin Quarter. Langston teased me that evening, telling me that I had no business speaking French better than he did. It was a joyous reunion, and after saying our goodbyes on a street corner facing Notre Dame Cathedral, we watched dear Langston walk up Boulevard Saint-Michel in search of the next morning's New York Herald Tribune. It was the last time I would see him. For the following year, he was gone.
So Langston, as we knew him, was someone who, along with our parents, dedicated his life to the cause of justice for Black Americans and other oppressed people around the world. He was our uncle and our friend, and through his writings and the books he suggested we read, helped us to understand the world and our rightful place in it.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
Baby, my curly-headed baby, sing you fast to sleep and love you.
That's just a little taste.
Am I live? Yes. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I join Saidi and MaryLouise and all the ancestors in saying thanks. And I'm excited to have a little bit of a conversation tonight, first with MaryLouise and then with everybody who might have questions and comments in the audience. And I thought it would be nice to start, if you don't mind, MaryLouise, by you telling us a little bit about how you put the book together, some of the adventures in compiling this amazing collection of letters. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, you are in for a treat because the writing is spectacularly beautiful. And the feeling in the letters is the feeling, if you will, of people who were trying to make a new world, who had gone off to see a new world, and who also drew strength and, to echo a word said toward the end of the documentary, solidarity in friendship. And that solidarity is kind of the purpose of why people try and try and try to make revolution. So,
thank you. I forgot to thank People's Forum and everyone here who made tonight possible, including Mary and Saidi. So thank you. And I have to say that it is a real honor to be here tonight also with Professor Ruth Gilmore from the graduate school, the Graduate Center of CUNY. So to answer that question, am I reverberant? Am I echoing?
Maybe I'll turn mine off.
A little bit. So my mother was the last of the 5 to be with us. And when she left, when she died, well, I should start out by saying that Nebi Lou and I had grown up with these letters. We had seen these letters and we had seen, of course, Langston all of our lives. And so when my mother died, I had her things, and amongst her things were these, in gathering her things together were these letters. And I realized that we couldn't just pass them down to our children. These letters belonged to all of us. I thought they were important enough, that they told an important enough story that they belonged to all of us. And so Nebi agreed, and we went up. The first thing we did was, so she had the letters that Langston had written her, and I had the letters that he had written my parents. And so we went to the Beinecke, which is on the Yale campus, the Beinecke Library, to see if Langston had kept any of the letters that they had obviously written him. And we got there, and for those of you who've never been in that kind of august space, that rarefied space on one of these Ivies universities or colleges, it really is kind of intimidating. You first of all, you have to get permission. You can't even just send a letter and say, "Can I come?" You have to be kind of recommended. You have to get a scholar to write to the library and say, please allow so and so to see these papers, even though they were papers that our parents had written, right? And so we got that, and we got up there, and it's a glassed-in box. It's all glass, and it's in the middle of the lobby. So if you could imagine not having that portion over there, that wall over there, and the whole thing is empty, And then there's this glass box. And you have to deposit your personal items in a locker. And then you're given a pair of white gloves. And you can take a pencil and a pad. And that's all you can take, and yourself. And you go in. And you go in, so they watch you. And then they bring whatever the documents are that you requested to see. So I'd never seen that before. So it was just, it was intimidating. And then there are cameras on you, right? Because you might steal these documents, who knows? So there we are, and they're files, and they're dividers. And here we are taking out the letters, and they were divided by years. So we're taking them out year by year. And we discover letters that we had written him as a child, one of, that long ago had forgotten about. And Langston had kept all of this. And, we're tearing up. We had no idea that he had kept the correspondence that he had kept. So that night we left, we're walking back to our B&B. And luckily, they had a wine and cheese hour, and Nebby said we couldn't put that in the book. But we both had wine, and it was. We were overwhelmed. We were so overwhelmed in finding this, and then we really knew that we had to give it to the world. We had to bring it to light. It took us 15 years. We had no money. We thought we had a literary agent who was initially interested, and then she dumped us. So we had no agent, we had no money, we had no publisher. We just had ourselves. Neither she nor I had ever written a book. And although we had known each other from before our births, right? We'd never worked together. And it wasn't a given that we'd work well together, right? But we managed, and we did work well together, and we became so much closer. But not only that, we discovered our parents from before we were born, who these people were, what they were thinking, what they were doing, how they related to one another, how they found one another, and fell in love and got married, and then we're born, and it's kind of so often we were asked when we were doing the book was published, I should say, in 2016, and February 1st, that's Langston's birthday. The book came out. It was published by University of California Press. And if it weren't for Professor Robin D.G. Kelly, the book would have never seen the light of day. And you all probably know who he is, or many of you may know who he is. He's an incredible scholar activist. He's a professor at UCLA. He heads the Department of African American Studies, and I think American history also. Robin's incredible and incredibly generous. And it was because of him that the book actually exists. So over 15 years, there we are. We'd meet and we'd put up these sheets of a butcher paper, like, what is that, what it's called? And we'd have our markers, and we were making charts, and we were, how are we going to do these letters? Are we going to do them chronologically, or are we going to, kind of mix it up? And we finally decided to do it chronologically because that was the easiest way. And then we'd make these charts and the letters by years, and what letters we had and what letters we didn't. And I won't go through the rest of it, just to say that we realized, though, that it was really important to give these letters context. And they're talking about events in the letters, people, political situations that most people would not know, because these were mostly left or working class or African American situations or experiences that would not have seen the light of day in the mass media, and certainly not in our textbooks. So there was no way that people would know. So we would have to give some kind of historical context, which meant research. We had no research money. So it meant that we ourselves had to do it with the help of friends. So this is really a labor of just not, I won't give up, we won't give up, we're gonna, even if we have to, we used to say, even if we have to mimeograph it, and many of you don't know what a mimeograph is. Yeah, it's like, no. So that a mimeograph was a machine that that took ink and it took paper in a way, and you typed onto this paper, and then you inked it, and then you kind of churned this thing like churning butter, and then you could reproduce copies. And it smelled horrible, and the ink got purple, and it got on your fingers, and if it got on your clothes, it never came out. Anyway, if we had to do that, and if we had to stand on 125th Street and 7th Avenue and hand it out, we were going to get this book out. So, so we did. We did. And I think it tells an incredible story, not only of these 5 people, but of their comrades and of their time and of ideas, and of devoting oneself to those ideas and living the life of those ideas, embodying those ideas that we can learn from. We can learn from today. So not to mention the preciousness of relationships. I don't know how you young people who don't know what a mimeograph machine is, but know so well what TikTok and Instagram and all of those things are, that I have no idea what they are. There is nothing that replaces, and I know this is a long answer. There's nothing that replaces hugging someone, looking in someone's eyes, seeing the smile in the eyes, on the face, feeling the vibes. I don't care how much you TikTok, or you can talk to me up and down about how great it is, or Instagram, or any of that. It does not replace actually physically being in the presence of someone else. It just doesn't. And these friendships really speak to that. So, I know this is, these things are absolutely essential now. We can't live our lives without them. But for you to know that they don't in any way substitute for the real deal, right? So that's the that's the real. That's the answer. So that's and we did it.
Mm-hmm.
We did it. Yeah.
One of the things that your beautiful answer makes me think, MaryLouise, is how you and your sister friend Nebby, and then your parents and Langston and the other people who are in this book and who inform the lives in this book, do over and over and over again the basic work of making revolution. It's in friendship, it's in welcoming strangers, it's in being brave and going to do something when you don't know how it's going to turn out and cannot know. It's in figuring out how to adjust in the midst of adventure and adversity, both, and not in some, James Fenimore Cooper adventure adversity way, but really in the hard work of, well, let me use a phrase you used when we were chatting before tonight's event. You talked about how everybody in this book, our parents' generation, their parents' generation, had the fire, in particular, the fire still burning from slavery, right? So They themselves had not been enslaved, but the fire of it was still there. Mm-hmm. And that fire drove a certain kind of intensity. And it didn't go always in the same way for all people. And you talk about Marcus Garvey, for example, in some of the context that you lay for the book. And yet that fire also brings into really clear and detailed relief what Cedric Robinson talked about when he discussed the ontological totality of the Black radical tradition. This is it. This friendship and making revolution and figuring out what to do next and disagreeing without falling apart, or falling apart and then coming together again. So I was thinking it would be great, maybe now, MaryLouise, if you'd read a couple of letters, maybe the letters between your father and Langston. Would you like to do that?
I would.
Shall we listen? Okay.
Also, I want to say, I want to acknowledge someone in the audience. His name is Eric Colvin. I couldn't, I guess, mention everyone in the audience that I know, but Eric, who's sitting over here on the end, helped us promote the book by acting, and he and I would read letters, and it was wonderful. And he taught me how to read. So I hope I do you proud tonight. So I think the point of it, Ruthie, was correct. How to disagree, how to be candid, principled in your disagreement, and actually fairly strident, but never disrespectful, and always listening to the response, but presenting what you believe, your opinion, openly, and trusting that who you're talking to, who you're engaged with, understands, knows that it's coming from a place of love. So I want to read it because what I read in the film is just an abbreviation of the letter. I think it also epitomizes, it really nails who my father was. He was a totally political, he woke up in the morning and breathing politics, and he went to bed, exhaling it. And it also is kind of epitomizes Langston, the response, who Langston was. So here we go. Dear Langston, so this was written June 7th, 1957, when his play Simply Heavenly was on Broadway. And if you haven't seen it or don't know about it, you can watch it on YouTube. Everything's on YouTube. This will be on YouTube probably by tomorrow. Dear Langston, Louise, Mary Lou, and I saw Simply Heavenly Tuesday night. Thanks for the tickets, and may I here and now very belatedly thank you for sending us I Wonder as I Wander, and several other books. That was the first of his autobiography. I Wonder as I Wander was excellent. Personally, I regard it as one of the best of the many fine things you've done. It seemed to me that in it you were more appreciative of the impact of social forces upon people than ever before, and that the naturalistic approach that I feel often characterizes your treatment of the reaction of an individual to his or her environment was absent. The result was I saw several individuals in larger dimensions. I saw them in the midst of social conflicts in which they were caught up, or in which at least were making a marked impact upon their lives. It is difficult to define my reaction to Simply Heavenly. I cannot say that I liked it. I'm not a theatrical critic, but in a formal sense, it did not appeal to me. It seemed loose and not up to your standard of theatrical production. However, I was never a stickler for form if in content a piece of art said something worthwhile. Simply Heavenly does not say what so greatly needs to be said at this moment, Lang, at least not to me. I'm not a prude. Some episodes of the animal impulses of a person may be amusing, some valuable educationally, but some may be posed so as to reflect discredit on a people. Then they do not prove that people's affinity to humanity, but rather the opposite. That is the way in which the portrayal of animal appetites, which almost dominates Simply Heavenly, struck me. It dehumanized the characters. Clearly, they did not appear to embody in themselves the qualities of real people. The characters ate, danced, prepared for the gratification of sexual desires, as though these things constituted the range of thought and action. No idea emerges to reveal that the terrible trials of a woman with 17 kids will force her to find some outlet for free expression. That there are simply heavenly people, no one can deny. But should they not be shown as warped and distorted, and some idea be given to the source of their deterioration? Or are they normal? If they are, what are their counterparts? Abnormal? They neither moved me to sympathy or revulsion. How tremendously complex is the life of a simple. Your simple oversimplified it with all the maudlin pathos he sought to inject into it. Your use of the jazz medium to carry the dialogue along helped it to flow and gave it rhythm. That I feel was fine. To me, Lang, the play was political, but the politics suited my enemies, Simple's enemies, aims and purposes in describing the Negro. The men who derive billions from our misery seek to find a justification for subjecting us to an environment that warps and destroys us to their great profit. Simply Heavenly certainly provides them some justification. This is not the time to aid Simple's enemies, with his friends in Montgomery, Ghana, and elsewhere, are fighting too desperately to effect fundamental changes. Some may argue, is there no time, no place for laughter? I heard much laughter there, and in the main from Negroes, to whom the subtleties that escaped a white person were clear. The answer is, there is a place for laughter. But the question is, how do you invoke healthy laughter at such an hour as this? I don't think you do it through an exposure of the frailty of Simple and his friends. The social life of the Negro people now runs the gamut of social life in the USA. The people on your stage revealed no real desire for change. They were in the right milieu. But today the emphasis is upon change, fundamental change. The Negro people may make the life of Simple endured, but I would today show them reacting differently to what they had been forced to make. Now, maybe that would not sell. I don't know. I think perhaps it would. When Simple tried to show the pressures on him, he does so too narrowly, and Joyce lacks such human qualities as would have enabled her to help him or he her. So Simple is the product of inner forces, mysterious forces, peculiar to Negroes. He is the eternally recurring primitive Negro, so childishly simple and so simply childish. He is the poor black burden his civilized white brother must carry through life. The time and place calls, I believe, for something else. Perhaps it ought to approach Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who on the same Tuesday night proved something in terms of the role today of the Negro people in America. The Negro can today play a more dominant moral role in American life. Thanks again. One must do more than dip one's fingers into progressive life. Simple won't help Montgomery. Not everything can be geared to help Montgomery, some say. Perhaps not. But Langston Hughes can help. He has done much to help all of us. His splendid contribution to the National Assembly of Authors and Dramatists was just such a helpful event. Carry on, and the best of things for you. Sincerely, Pat. Langston answered the very next day. Now, for those of you, you ought to know who don't know, because you weren't born then, mail used to be delivered twice a day. Can you believe that? Twice a day. Nowadays, it takes a week for a letter to get to Brooklyn from Manhattan. Anyway, Langston got the letter, and he's writing the very next day, June 8th. Dear Pat, I'm certainly sorry I wasn't at the theater the night you all came, as I would have loved to have said hello to you. Your long letter is greatly appreciated, and your views valid in a number of ways, I'm sure. But it's the old story and the old problem I've been wrestling with for years. How to get everything to suit everybody into one piece. When it comes to plays, it's a miracle to end up with anything at all one wishes left in the play after 20 or 30 other people have had a hand in the creation, from producers and director to actors. The problems with this particular show were legion, so to have left flying saucers and Mississippi is at least something. Several folks have expressed your viewpoint with variations, re-race, while others, as you've no doubt read and heard, take the opposite viewpoint, like Roosevelt Ward. Resex therein, some feel as you do. Others term it a friendly show, a family show, and come to see it again, bringing the kids. So, quien sabe? If, as you think, it is a lulling show, maybe there is some virtue in lulling with one hand while lopping with the other. Semantics? Hey now. Anyhow, there's plenty left out of this version of Simple that I wish were in. But in books, one has 300 pages to work with. In a play, only 80. In publishing, only one editor to contend with, and mine almost never suggests changes. But in the theater, everybody pulls and hauls at a script. So all I can say is, I did the best I could under the circumstances. Next time might be luckier, maybe come out better. Let's hope so. That it gets your serious consideration and you write me so helpful a letter is at least something to be grateful for. Best ever, and hope to see you and the family soon as work pressures let up. That show threw me back weeks on other deadlines. Besides being the most frustrating, theater is also about the most time-taking of the arts. Wonder will I ever catch up? Sincerely. And Langston. Yeah.
Listening to you read the letter was so different from reading it silently on my own. Oh, whoops, sorry. Let me try it. Live again. Listening to you read the letter so beautifully, thank you, was so different from reading it on my own, in part because what you do with your voice in reading it is to infuse the deep, deep love that prompted your father to write as he wrote, as well as prompted Langston to reply as he replied. I didn't doubt the love was there, but I could hear it in your voice, and that was really beautiful, and why theater is a good thing, even though it might be the most time-taking thing there is, other than going to archives and putting together books. And I got to thinking as I was listening too about the kinds of internationalism that everybody in this book and their wider milieu, the cadres they were part of, were constantly trying to bring to the fore. So there's a small way in which your father says, Ghana, Montgomery, right? But it's Ghana, Montgomery. That the problems that he's laying out, even though they are so particular to the 1957, even I was born, the situation of Black people in the United States, or as we were then, the American Negro, could only be understood and fully appreciated in the context of the world movement for decolonization and emancipation. So I wonder if we could maybe go back a little bit in time in our discussion and talk about when the five friends and their many comrades set sail on the SS Europa in order to make their way to the Soviet Union to make the film that was never made. Could we talk a little bit about that moment in the 1930s, 1932? Am I right? So this is like really pivotal, 32, 33. It's a big shift in geopolitics on the planet. And it's the time when the Friends set forth and tried to figure out how to find their way politically and socially and as friends into this internationalist arena in order to realize emancipation at home, wherever home might be. So could we talk about that a little bit? We're trying to avoid feedback.
So I'm not a historian. And I want to say, I want to disclaim. So if I get anything wrong, you all, dates or anything else, please don't hesitate to, just say, hey, wait a minute, little faux pas there, an error there. So 1932 is 15 years after the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution of 1917 really changed the ball game, really. And so this is only 15 years afterwards. This is after the Red Summer of 1919, when returning African-American soldiers from World War I. So you all know that World War I took place then, and it's over in 1919. The Russian Revolution is 1917, and these Black soldiers are coming back from fighting in Europe, and they're wearing their uniforms, and they're proud, and they are ready to fight, to further the fight for African-American freedom. And they're met with tremendous, violent, just horrific, violent opposition. And there was what was called the Red Summer of 1919. So that was now, only 13 years from this 1932. So the Soviet Union is seen as the workers as a place where the workers have taken over, and they've kicked the bosses to the side, to the curb. And in response to that, so many artists, so many people flocked to the Soviet Union to see what was happening and what this new workers' world looked like. So they're going there. And that's just to give you a little context. I mean, it was also on the end of the Harlem Renaissance period, which, Ruth was talking about, which was also this period of such promise of creative, political, socio-political ferment, and artists and writers and painters and sculptors and, African Americans are coming all to Harlem and, jumping in this Harlem pot. And it was a really, as we said in the film, it was a real heady time. On every street corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street, on each street corner, there was a speaker talking about, their political analysis, their political vision of the world as it was today, and what they envisioned the world tomorrow would be. So they're going to this place that started all of that, right? But they weren't really political people, and they weren't even actors. When you read the book, I mean, there was one actor amongst them. So they're going to make this film, and when they get there, they encounter that the script is impossible, and then they are. Langston decides, they ask Langston agrees to help work on the script to try to make it something that they could use. The film was going to be called Black and White, and it was, in brief, there is a strike in a plant in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was a steel city in the South, and so white workers, so the black workers are going on strike. They're up against the white bosses and the scabs and the hired hands of the white bosses. And so white workers from the North are coming down in solidarity with the black workers, and they're going to win the struggle, and et cetera. It was an impossible script, and so Langston agrees to stay in the Soviet Union to work on the script, to try to make it something that would be possible to be turned into a film. Meanwhile, they're offered a tour of the Soviet Union. But the humorous piece of this is that the people that went over, and you saw photographs of them, were of all shades of black. But in the Soviet Union, they weren't aware that black people came in all colors. So there were black people that arrived in this delegation that the Soviets said, well, but they're not black. How can we have them in this film? Anyway, there were all kinds of those kinds of, kind of humorous absurdities that occurred because, basically they didn't know. They didn't know about the United States really, and I mean, they knew enough to have demonstrations and meetings, mass meetings around Scottsboro. But what black people look like in our daily lives, et cetera, they really didn't know. So wait a minute, what did you ask me?
Pretty much what you answered.
Yeah.
Wait, I'm sorry.
So the end of the story is, I'll end the story. The film was not made, and at that time, the Soviet Union had not gotten official recognition from the United States, and they wanted that recognition. And they were told there was an American engineer. They were building a huge dam so that they could have electricity. So this was the period of massive building in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And they were building this huge this dam that would provide electricity. And the chief engineer was an American. And the story goes that he told Stalin, he was kind of the intermediary between the incoming FDR government and Stalin, that if they made this film, that the U.S. would not help them build this dam. And so the film was scuttled. But it was from Louise's and Langston's standpoint, and Matt's also, it was scuttled because it was an impossible script as well. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't made, and then two camps developed there in the Soviet Union, in Moscow. One camp felt that the Soviet Union had sold them out, and that they should have just been brave enough to go ahead and make the film. And the other camp said, first of all, the script is impossible, and they can't do that anyway. So that's the end of the story. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a remarkable story in so many ways, and when you read the book, you will see the depth of the complexity and drama, and the two camps falling apart. And it wasn't 50-50 at all. It was like three, and then everybody else, including the great Dorothy West, was on the good side of history. She was. And so one of the stories about this drama that played out in the U.S. press was more or less, and I paraphrase here, Negroes sold out by communists, as though that's what the conflict was. Whereas, in fact, many of the people who had either joined the party or who subsequently joined the party remained true to a vision of remaking the world, in which, you know, people and their emancipation and the wherewithal of life would be allocated in a way that took profit out of the picture. And, or to put it in another way, to the extent that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it, being anti-capitalist seemed persistently to people to be the way to fight racism, right? Not as on the side, but straight on. And your mother, Louise Patterson, was quite the orator as well as a beautiful writer. And she remained true to the vision of changing the world, as did your father. And we talked a little bit about maybe reading one of her letters to Langston, if you would.
There are a lot of letters. There are like 400 missives in this book. There are letters that are missing. We just couldn't find them, but they refer to them, so we know they existed. I just chose a letter that Louise, because I think that it so captures who she was. This is a letter that she wrote in February of 1933 to Langston. They went to the Soviet Union in 32, and she came back in November of 32. And this letter is written in February of 1933. Dear Lang, Mother slipped away quietly last Thursday morning at 7 o'clock. Services were Friday at 3, and Howard Thurman conducted a most beautiful ceremony which was a tribute worthy of Mother Thompson. I have a great sense of peace and quiet now, and quiet happiness, for my mother is no longer suffering. She suffered such intense agony, and particularly during the last 10 days, it was so terrible for her, so that anyone who loved her could only be glad when her suffering had ended. Everyone has been most kind. Your mother came frequently and stayed many of those last nights with us. We had a nurse for Mama when she became so low, but your mother and others came each day and night to do what they could, so that that experience I had dreaded most of all in my life became relatively easy. On the one hand, because since there was no other relief for Mama, I wanted her to go. And on the other hand, those about us helped so much. I have no plans for making any change at present. Mary is here with me. Then Doris and Emily have been with us and will continue for a while anyway. Tomorrow morning, I shall return to work. In other words, I shall go ahead living as I know Mother would wish it, missing her very much, but indulging in no morbidity. The Scottsboro boys and Angelo Herndon must be saved, and one must sublimate his personal problems to the great struggle. I received your cable, and finally your letter came from Moscow. I'm glad to think that it may not be so long before I shall be seeing you again. There is much to do here, Lang, and we need you. In Harlem, we've succeeded in stirring a number of intellectuals and petty bourgeois elements on Scottsboro and Herndon. We have a Sunday night forum at Augusta Savage's and have begun a Marxian study circle. Then there are many other things, and now I shall throw my every minute into the thing. We held 2 large mass meetings on Scottsboro at Abyssinian and St. Philip's churches and had about 1,000 Harlem Negroes. And Lauren wrote that he was trying to interest LA people in Scottsboro. Also that he was trying to begin a left-wing magazine for Negro intellectuals. He's one of those who went on the trip and a very good friend. Lang, I wish you would try to bring something definite back with you from Measure-Poem, which was the film company in Moscow, concerning the film. Go to them about it. Ford has asked that I ask you to do this. I would like to write more, but have no time. Love to you, your pal Lou. Yeah. I mean, that was Louise. That was quintessential Louise. She and her mother were very close, and but and her love for her mother. But her mother my grandmother suffered enormously. Back then, in those days, they didn't really have very much. They did have morphine, and so they gave my grandmother morphine, and she pretty much was out of it most of the time. But there was nothing else. There was no hospice. There was, no other kind of help. So when she died, my mother was, in fact, relieved that her mother was gone. But then she's right in it, And I think she also understood that involving oneself in struggle, being busy, but being meaningfully busy, especially if you could be meaningfully busy, that was the best way to deal with that profound sense of loss and pain. So that was who she was. Yeah. And we want to leave time for questions.
Yes, we do. Yeah. So maybe this is a good time to open up for questions. And I already see a hand.
All right.
And I think Saidi has to run around.
Yeah, just raise your hand and I'll come give you the mic so folks online can hear you.
There you are. All right, here comes the mic.
Hi. Oops. Thank you so much for the presentation and for what it sounds like a wonderful book, which I haven't read yet, and presumably is available here to buy? Yeah, okay. So I was just wondering, was every letter that you found included in the book?
Yes, every letter. We included every letter. We actually wrote for my mother and my father's FOIA files, Freedom of Information Act files from the FBI to see if we, what they had. And they did not provide any letters. So those were all the letters that we found.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you guys both for talking to us. And I'm currently writing a piece and working on a piece which deals with the subversive use of art in social movements. And I'm also getting ready to spend the summer looking for these documents from artists who have been forgotten or pieces of art by prominent artists which have been overlooked and forgotten. So, this book is going to be one of my first sources. But how was it? And can you talk a bit more about the process or any tips that you'd have for looking for pieces of art and, writing that has been left out, specifically, particularly leftists or those relating to social movements?
I think both of us should answer that because I can only speak to, our particular experience. Well, I have to admit, I did go to Google. Google knows all. But I went to, on the internet, I also have to say I did not go to the Library of Congress. I didn't go to DC, other than to see my father's papers are at the Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard University. So I went there. And at the time, I wanted to also see Paul Robeson's papers, which are there, but they were not available to the public, so I did not have access to them. But there are, so Google is one place, I have to admit, it is one place. And sometimes they will list in a bibliography other sources, and I went to those. And I sometimes went down the rabbit hole, and it just seemed endless. And it was such a learning process. That's part of why it took so long. It was such a learning process for us, because we learned about things that they talked about in the letter that we didn't know, and we thought we were both fairly reasonably well educated, right, as to the left and movements and people. There were there was a lot that we didn't know, an awful lot. So I went on all different, the Marxist-Leninist website, and then I also wrote to people in London and asked them to help research. And I also had a friend who was writing, a British friend who was writing writing a book at the time on Caribbean communists and workers' movements. And he was going to the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, to Russia to look at the KGB and the files in Russia. And so I asked him if he would look, and since my father had gone to the University of the Toiling Workers of the East in Moscow, and he was going to be looking in those papers to please look for me. So I got some from him. The KGB files are at the Library of Congress. You have to, if you know names of people that you can look up, then you can try to find where their papers, if they were people who were prominent enough or had papers, or you think they had papers, to try to find where they are and then look at them. And I'll stop there because I know Ruthie knows more, but we did write for their FOIA files. And for those of you who, hopefully this is also interesting, so the Freedom of Information files are files primarily from the FBI. If you are looking for files beyond the FBI, you have to write to those particular those entities, such as the CIA, the DIA, which is Defense Intelligence. If you want the red squads, the police departments, what were called red squads in the police department, you have to ask for those papers separately. And it takes a while. And in our case, it took 3 years. And it finally took, because I applied through a lawyer directly, but it finally took an academic friend, a scholar, was what got them when I never got them from the FBI. But the scholar who requested the papers actually did get them. So, and then I've heard people have, just written and gotten their papers. So I don't know how that happens, on their end, how they decide to send or not send. And of course, what you get from them can be heavily redacted, pages that are just completely blacked out.
Exactly. I just have a little bit to add, not a lot. You've probably already done this, but I'll say it out loud anyway. If you start from what you think subversive is in the particular situation that you're delving into, then the next thing to think is, well, what agency or entity, to use MaryLouise's word, would view this artist's work as subversive? And then that gives you the clue whether you write to the New York City Red Squads or the FBI or whomever. Because there are so many different police and surveillance agencies in the world. They continue to proliferate. And that's one way. And then another way is to think about how you can zero in on a particular artist by way of a work of art, and perhaps, again, this is probably something you've already done, figure out whether people have any of that person's work in their collection, or if they've passed on, where their archive is. A friend of mine who teaches at CUNY at Hunter has been working on a project for some years now with artists who were part of the artists who came together to oppose the Whitney Museum's decision to, somehow suddenly confer art status on a very small, select group of Black artists. And so the rebuttal show is something that Howard's been working on with a lot of other people, not alone. But finding those works has been detective work as well. But then eventually coming across an incredible trove that, you described this, that somebody's daughter's, surviving spouse has in the attic or in the basement, elsewhere. So some ideas.
And also if they're living or recently deceased, finding their colleagues, their comrades who are alive and interviewing them, or at least trying to interview them, or at least get some information from them about the person, is also as you can tell, I believe in laying on of hands. I'm a retired pediatrician, so I'm people. Find the people. So, anyway,
yeah.
All right, we have time for about 2 more questions. I'm going to go over here.
Peace, good afternoon. Wonderful exchange, and belated happy birthday, my love. Could you share any of the, to give us a better sense of the milieu that we're talking about, the exchanges between your father, Langston Hughes, and a few other great luminaries at that time who were all pushing in the same direction, Du Bois and Robeson, their contacts, their conversations, their projections, their challenges, anything that you could share that would illuminate to us some of those dynamics that were going, because there were some other great luminaries, including, of course, your father, Hubert Harrison. There were some great luminaries going on at that time. What was some of the, what could you share? What are you allowed to share on those? Thank you.
I also must say that for a lot of this, I was still a child. So I start out by saying that, to say, growing up, I didn't, it's when you become an adolescent and you become cognizant of the world around you, you're beyond your immediate milieu, your family, your grandparents, your neighborhood, that there's a larger world. And that people that you may know may have some prominence or some import in that larger world as well, not just the little tiny family circle, right? So that's when you find out, that you realize that Langston Hughes, who's been coming to the house, and his uncle Lang, as I so cheekily wrote him a letter, Dear Uncle Lang, and Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois, who are people whose homes you have been in, and you've sat at the table, and they've been at your house and they've sat at your table, that all of a sudden these are people who, are really important figures, and you didn't really know that. You couldn't know that, right? So they were, Du Bois was, for me as a child, kind of intimidating. I have to say, he didn't intend to be by any means, but there was just an air about Du Bois. And he wore a 3-piece suit, so the vest, and he had the watch, the pocket watch with the chain. And there was something that was kind of unapproachable about him, as opposed to Paul or Langston, who would immediately have you on their laps, when you were a child. That wasn't Du Bois. And when we would go over to Du Bois lived in Brooklyn, and we lived in Brooklyn, and when we would go to his home, it usually was a party or a dinner party. I mean, I don't mean necessarily a dance party. And so I was put to bed. You know, I was put to bed. My father and Du Bois were always, I mean, they'd kind of go off in a corner, and there was, you know, they would, I guess, you know, they were talking politics. With Paul and Langston, especially Paul, I didn't see after I saw him in the Soviet Union, and then that was in 1960. First of all, thank you for the belated birthday gifts and greetings. And for those of you who don't know, and you don't know, none of you know, yesterday I was 80 spins around the earth. I completed 80 spins around the earth yesterday. So thank you. So I went to medical school in the Soviet Union, and that's the last time that I saw Paul alive. Of course, my parents saw him, but then when he was really ill and living in Philadelphia, my father would go visit, but I never visited him. So I only remember him really as a child, and just how warm that voice of his, and he didn't come over a lot. Langston came over a lot, and he's the one that I remember the best. And it was like Santa Claus was coming. I can't tell you. Langston was so much fun. I mean, he first of all, he made me feel important. It wasn't he was just coming to see my parents. I felt like he was coming to see me. And he made me feel that way. They were, you know, and one thing that Ruthie and I were talking about inside that I do want to, in the back, that I do want to mention was joy. And bringing that for them, the joy, so much of the joy in their lives was in forging these personal relationships that were forged in struggle. So there were the relationships, and then there was the larger struggle that they were all dedicated to. And so Langston would come over, there was always going to be food. Or when, I remember one time when Paul came with his accompanist, Larry Brown, wonderful man, and Larry brought lamb chops. And oh, the smell of the lamb cooking and my mother in the kitchen. Oh, I mean, it was wonderful. It was so, I guess when I was an adolescent, I was aware that you know, my parents, well, earlier than that actually, because my father went to jail, that my parents were the enemies. You know, you had this, you know, this country, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and then you had my parents, and somehow, you know, and I loved my parents and I believed what they said. And that was juxtaposed to what I was hearing in school. And it was during the McCarthy period, and I couldn't tell my friends in school who my parents were. And so there was this kind of very segregated life. I mean, you had compartmentalized life. You had life here, and then you had life here. But the tremendous respect and love. I grew up, my closest friends were outside of my couple of friends that I had whose parents were not communists, were children of other African-American communists who were my parents, you know, they were comrades, but they were also very close friends. And Dorothy and Lou Burnham, and Esther and Jim Jackson, and Augusta and Ed Strong. And, you know, we were sleeping at each other's homes overnight. the partnerships that these couples had with each other, my mother and my father's relationship. And for you young people, my father said to me one time that he would not have a relationship at home that caused him to fight at home, because every time he stepped out of the front door, he had to fight. And so the profound friendship that my parents had true friendship with each other, I never heard them raise their voices. It sounds remarkable because I fuss and fight all the time, but they never raised their voices. They never called each other a word that was disrespectful. Never, ever. They really embodied what they believed in terms of treating another, extending that humanity and that regard for the humanity, that love for the humanity to the other. And anyone who was ever, if there's anybody in the audience who knew my parents and knew their friends, knows that when you went to the home, you were welcomed, you were embraced, and you felt the warmth. You felt the genuine warmth and love. It really was special. And we talked about, these were the people who carried as a wonderful actress who was also a friend, Viney Burroughs said, they carried that fire of knowing slavery, enslavement, and the tremendous violence and dehumanization that was meted upon African Americans in every way. We were humiliated all the time. And they carried that fire in their bellies. We're distanced from that. We read about that, right? We're distanced from that kind of enslavement, chattel slavery, okay? But they carried that in them, and that's what steeled them. They were steeled in that cauldron. It was really special. It's really special. And so you think of a Paul Robeson as being larger, but that's where he comes from. That's what made him and made them and their commitment. They said if capitalism was what brought chattel slavery, then you can't look to capitalism to answer to free you. It was what enslaved you. So it ain't gonna free you. And that was really, I know I'm simplifying, but I really do think it's that clear. It was that clear for them that you couldn't have Black capitalism, you couldn't somehow have, some other kind of blunted, you couldn't kind of polish capitalism or, off at the edges. You just couldn't, it was the problem. It was the problem. And you weren't going to be freed under capitalism. And that was their position. And then they understood the relationships both on the level of the boss and the worker, but also on the personal level, how capitalism shapes our personal relationships, and so that their personal relationships were so special. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I could do right now.
Well then. We have time for one more, I think. Here comes the mic.
So either all the rest of you, we've answered all your questions, or you're just completely out of it.
Ooh.
I don't mean out of it in that way, but we confused you completely. You have no way to answer
No, Doc, I think they're very much with us. First of all, you gave me a compliment about working with you with these letters. I'd like to thank you for involving me in the first place, because much of this history, I think of myself as having some general sense of our history, as it were, but I really, really wasn't in touch with this history until you asked me to be part of the project. I'm remembering especially up at City College when Dr. Kelly moderated your program. Randy Weston played music as we read some of your letters. Very special night. I still remember it. You talked about the affinity with all of the people you mentioned and their closeness and their warmth and concern and love, really, between them. I saw that between yourself and Nebi Lou, the last time I saw her that evening. But in terms of your research, sometimes writers and others, artists working together, it's not always a smooth road. How was it working with Nebi in putting this together?
So Nebi is older than I am by 6 years. And so, and she was one of the most intelligent people I've ever known. Exceedingly well-read, very internationally, traveled. She lived in Paris, she lived in Africa. She'd traveled many places. And so sometimes it was like an older sister, younger sister relationship. But most of the time we were on par. I mean, we very quickly realized that there needed to be a division of labor, that both of us couldn't do everything. And so I took the part of doing the research, and she started the writing. And as soon as we decided that we would do it chronologically, then that kind of fell into place. Yeah, there were disagreements. And at one point, we went to Howard Dodson, who was the head of the Schomburg Library at the time, over one of the disagreements. And without going into the detail, I remember Howard saying to us, you have to let their voices sing. Mm-hmm. That's a quote, actually. We tried to work it out as amiably and amicably and respectfully as possible. I mean, we never had a knockdown, drag out kind of disagreement. No, I think we really were a team. This was, we had to get it done, and we realized it was going to take both of us. Yeah, but there were times that she was my older sister. Yeah, and there were times when I was the younger, obstreperous one. So yeah, it went both ways. But we came out of it so much. I mean, we learned so much about each other, not only about our parents, but about each other, and our relationship really was deepened so much as a result of working together on this project. Yeah, and finding out who we were through finding out who our parents, where we came from. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank everyone for coming, and again, thank the People's Forum. And
I see hands.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I don't know. It's People's Forum.
We could just take the last question.
Okay. There are two hands in the back.
Yeah, there are two hands in the back.
Could we do this?
Heidi, if you
could we hear all three questions?
Really
yeah, and then we'll answer.
I was just curious about about Langston naming names in the hearings, and that he mentioned Robeson's name and how that the fallout, the understanding. And also, what was his reasoning? Was it that Robeson was already known, and so therefore it would be a safe thing to do? And that's my question.
And that's your answer. Yeah.
And that's your answer.
Mm-hmm. All right, then.
Hi, I was just gonna kind of ambush you at the end and ask you, but we came from kind of far away, mostly to see you, because it's like your life is extraordinary and the story is extraordinary in so many ways. And I kind of had a question about the internationalist aspect of it and kind of how you decided to study medicine in the Soviet Union. Where did you go afterwards? Did you go to other places? Where did you learn French? And then so I don't know, if you have anything to say about that, that'd be great.
They're gonna have to invite me back. Is that the last question? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I just want to, the answer is to the first question about naming names. So some of you may know that during that period, coming out of World War II, when the Soviet Union during World War II was our ally, coming out of World War II, now the Soviet Union is our nemesis, right? So, and there were committees that were founded in Congress and in the Senate to ferret out this enemy within us, right? And so there was a famous case that came out in 1949 called the Hollywood 10, and these were one of the areas that they began to look into in depth to try to ferret out these communists and these Reds and so forth was the arts. The other was the armed forces. So the arts was attacked, and the Hollywood 10 were Hollywood writers who ultimately went to jail. They lost their jobs. They went to jail. Several of them left the country. And the thing was that actors like Ronald Reagan went in front of the committee and he spouted out a whole bunch of names. And that's what you did in order to save your own skin. So you named names. So Langston says, the only name that I had that I gave was Paul's, which was a known name. But the backstory to that is that Langston met with McCarthy the day before with his lawyer, and McCarthy said, if you do blah, 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 then, I'll be light on you. I'll go light on you. And then when they got in the hearing the following day, McCarthy just went after him tooth and nail. It was horrible. And Langston was sick for a long time after that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the only name that he named was Paul Robeson. Thank you very much. I don't know where you came from. Where'd you come from? Oh,
wow.
I am honored. We're honored that you came all the way from Ithaca. Thank you for coming. And we can talk a little bit afterwards. In the foreword in the book, I do write a little bit about my own journey, but also hopefully in maybe 2 or 3 years, we'll be back here with my memoir, because I'm trying. So if I say it out loud, then you'll push me to do it, and you'll know more. But I'll talk with you if you can stay afterwards a little bit.
Actually, MaryLouise, it's very special because the only question that we had on the chat was, when can we expect a book from you about your life? So the energy, we're rooting for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming, and I just leaning on Ruthie a little bit earlier.
I'm totally going to make it happen. I've committed to this publicly and through Zoomlandia. And yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming out, and thank you, dear MaryLouise Patterson. And I'm just thinking of leaving us with a phrase from Pat Patterson's letter to Langston. How complex is the life of a simple? And that's what we've been talking about tonight. Not about the character in the play, but about all of the complexities that went into and go into being Black communists in this world, part of the people. All power.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. A huge thank you to Mary Louise and Ruthie, and for the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics.